Hey everyone, just quickly before we get into this episode, I wanted to remind you that the Threaducation Patreon is now live. There you'll find exclusive content about the business side of the fashion industry, case studies on the marketing strategies and business models of your favorite designers, and practical guides to launching a successful brand of your own. So with that said, back to today's episode. Anyone that keeps a close eye on the next generation of great designers has probably been hearing the name KidSuper a lot recently. As we'll discuss, KidSuper's founder, Colm Dillane, has actually been in the industry for quite a while, but it seems as if he's just now starting to get his fair share of the spotlight. So in this episode, I want to take it back to the very beginning. I want to take a look at how a kid from Brooklyn with a crazy idea went on to steal the show at Paris Fashion Week, not just as the lead designer for his own label, but as the lead designer for one of the world's largest fashion houses as well. It really is a crazy story, so without further ado, let's get into it. This is the Rise of KidSuper. Colm Dillane was born in New York City, but spent most of his childhood moving from place to place, including Illinois, Wisconsin, and at one point he even lived in Mexico. But at the age of 12, his family moved back to New York City, and that is where our story begins. For the most part, he was a normal kid. He went to school, he played soccer, and in his free time, his favorite thing to do was make art. However, one thing that separated him from the other kids his age was how smart he was. I think this may get overshadowed by his fun, easygoing persona, but Colm is extremely smart and was accepted into Brooklyn Technical High School, which is exclusive to students who are gifted in the sciences. So that's where he attended high school, and there he discovered yet another thing that separated him from the kids his age. They all cared about wearing the coolest brands and the newest sneakers, which is something that he had never really thought twice about. He saw them spending hundreds of dollars on Vuitton Supreme and couldn't quite wrap his mind around why anyone would pay that much for a screen-printed t-shirt. A lot of kids in his position probably would have done the same just to fit in, but that's not how Colm operates. Instead, he saw what was happening and had an idea. As I just mentioned, he loved making art, but up until this point, he hadn't really found a way to make money off of it. And he now realized how much people were willing to spend on clothing, so he decided to launch his own line of t-shirts. To do so, he joined forces with a couple of his friends, and together they launched Brick Oven t-shirts, which was called Bots for short. They were able to sell a handful of the shirts, mostly to friends at school, but generally speaking, Bots never really caught on, and their attempts to get local stores to stock their pieces were, by and large, unsuccessful. Aesthetically speaking, they thought that the shirts they were making were on par with the shirts that Vuitton Supreme were making, but far fewer people were willing to spend their money on a Brick Oven t-shirt than they were on a box logo tee, even if the box logo tee was way more expensive. Anyways, as is the case with all t-shirt brands started by groups of high school friends, they divided up whatever little earnings they'd made and agreed to part ways after graduation. But this would not be the end of Colm's newfound interest in the world of fashion. It was just the beginning. In 2010, after graduating from high school, he enrolled at NYU to study mathematics. While that may seem like an odd choice for someone as artistically inclined as himself, recall what I said about him being extremely smart. Beyond that, he's the type of person that likes to challenge himself, and he's actually explained his decision to study mathematics by saying that math is all about problem solving, and problem solving requires creativity. Either way, his mind and heart were still set on fashion, so while in school, he decided to try launching a new brand. The first order of business was picking a name for this new brand, and he settled on the name KidSuper. Now there's no denying that KidSuper has a nice ring to it, but where did this name come from? Well, as the story goes, he was freestyling with some of his friends, and without thinking too much of it, he referred to himself as the Super Kid. That's when one of his friends interjected and told him that KidSuper sounded better, and the rest is history. To Colm, the name KidSuper was symbolic of a young kid with a big dream who refused to let anything get in his way, and it resonated so strongly with him because he was that kid. So with that settled, he got to work on his first collection, and to call it a collection might be overstating things, because in reality it was just a short sleeve t-shirt, a long sleeve t-shirt, and a hat, all emblazoned with the name KidSuper. Fortunately, he'd made a friend at NYU that knew how to make websites, so rather than marketing his products towards his inner circle or local brick and mortar stores like he'd done with his first brand, he was now able to sell products online. Well, that was great and all, but he knew that he still needed to get his name out there. So the very same week that he launched the website, he messaged a member of Mac Miller's crew, essentially on a whim, and said that he'd love to give Mac some pieces the next time that he was in New York. It just so happened that Mac was already in New York filming a music video, so they sent him the address, and Colm showed up to deliver the pieces in person. He was a big fan of Mac and had never really been around anyone famous, so he was understandably nervous, but when they actually came face to face, that nervousness quickly subsided, because as he recalls it, Mac was incredibly down to earth and put on all of the pieces the moment he got them. Presumably still in awe, Colm left the set just happy to have gotten his work into the hands of an artist that he admired. But even after all of that, he couldn't have possibly predicted what would happen next. About 3 months later, he opened iTunes and could hardly believe his eyes when he saw that Mac Miller was wearing his hat right on the banner. It turns out that Mac was unveiling his new album Blue Slide Park and had decided to wear a KidSuper hat in the promotional material. In hindsight, I'm not sure how much of an impact this actually had on the brand, because you couldn't even see the name KidSuper on the hat. But at the time, Colm felt like this was his big break. At the very least, it was the validation he needed to keep chasing this dream of his, and it also gave him the right to tell everyone that Mac Miller was a fan of KidSuper. Between this and a couple of local artists that started to wear the brand, KidSuper was slowly starting to build some momentum. By his sophomore year, orders were starting to come through on the website, and to keep up with the demand, he quite literally transformed his college dorm room into a design studio / pop-up shop. He repainted the walls, set up some clothing racks, and announced that he was open for business. Well, unfortunately, that didn't last too long, because as soon as the school found out what he was doing, they told him to shut it down. To Colm's credit, he did fight back. He marched into the dean's office wearing a suit and presented a formal business plan, arguing that the school should be supporting his entrepreneurship instead of shutting it down. But alas, it seems that fell upon deaf ears, because in the end, the dean's message to Colm could not have been more clear. Either stop what you're doing, or do it somewhere else. Colm knew that KidSuper was moving in the right direction, so stopping was never even a real consideration. But now that his school had given him an ultimatum, he had no choice but to move his operations somewhere else. So he began searching online for a space where he could continue producing and selling his pieces, and eventually stumbled upon a spot in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. It was a bit of a fixer-upper, and if we're being honest, Williamsburg wasn't really seen as the epicenter of New York's streetwear scene, but it gave him enough room to build out a studio and storefront. Plus, the real selling point was that it had a bathtub. You see, Colm wanted to make sure that he could also live in this new studio, because he'd be spending nearly all of his time there anyway. So without ever seeing it in person, he agreed to begin renting out the space, and that is how KidSuper got its first real studio. Now for Colm, this felt like a big step forward, and it certainly was, but as he was about to discover, he still had a long way to go. As he recalls, he hosted a lunch party for the store, and it was packed to the brim with friends and members of the local streetwear scene. But after that first night, when the store actually opened for business, it was basically empty. Yes, he'd been receiving all of this positive feedback, but this wake-up call made him realize that he needed to drown that out for the time being and just focus on the clothing. So that's what he did, and over time, he started to build some natural momentum. And here's where I want to talk a bit about what separated KidSuper from all of the other brands out there. As I mentioned earlier, Colm had always been into making art, and his pieces were, quite literally, works of art. It's as if he treated the fabric as his canvas. The bright colors, bold patterns, and unique motifs were hard for anyone to miss. But the brilliant thing is that he was able to take all of these components and then effortlessly tie them together into one stunning piece. It's as if every piece he made was, by nature, a statement piece. It's the type of clothing that makes people stop and say, "Hey, where'd you get that?" And that is exactly how the name KidSuper slowly started making its way out of Williamsburg and into the streets of Soho and beyond. So all things considered, I'd say that the brand's growth in the beginning was very natural. It was all word of mouth, but before long, it seemed as if word was starting to spread like wildfire. The space in Williamsburg quickly became a destination for local artists, musicians, and streetwear fanatics. They'd come from far and wide to buy clothes, hang out, and even record music. You see, Colm had decided to turn the building's basement into a recording studio because he wanted to use the space to help other creatives chase their dreams, and it just so happens that one of those creatives was Russ. Back then, Russ was still looking for his big break and needed a place to record, so Colm welcomed him in with open arms. Well, as we know now, several of the songs that Russ recorded in KidSuper's basement would go on to become smash hits, with a few of them even going platinum. So it's kind of cool to think that Colm was helping other people launch their careers while he was still trying to launch his own. In hindsight, he had set out to start a brand, but in the process somehow ended up starting a movement. I mean, that's really what it was. A bunch of creatives gathered in this one building in Williamsburg who are now becoming figureheads in New York's local fashion and music scenes. I wouldn't say that KidSuper had made it big just yet, especially not in comparison to what it is now, but people were starting to take notice. One of the first big brands to take notice was Converse. They didn't offer him a collaboration or anything like that, but they did pay him $5,000 to appear in one of their ad campaigns. That may not sound like too much, but that didn't matter, because it was proof that brands as big as Converse were paying attention to KidSuper. Now that was cool, but Colm didn't just want to be recognized by the big brands, he wanted to become one of the big brands. And with that in mind, he became intently focused on getting KidSuper to that next level. As a brand owner trying to break into the upper echelon of the industry, this seemed like the logical next step. But don't get any grand ideas, because he didn't just walk his way into Fashion Week. Thanks to one of his friends, he got permission to host the show at Soho House, which, in case you aren't familiar, is an exclusive members-only club. The collection itself featured just 7 women's wear looks, but those in attendance had plenty to keep them entertained because the show also featured a performance from New York's own Joey Badass. Taking everything into account, this sounds like a fun show to be at, but the only slight caveat to all of this is that KidSuper was not actually on the official 2017 New York Fashion Week calendar. Colm had just decided to host the show during Fashion Week, which is actually quite common for newer brands, but at the end of the day, he wanted KidSuper to be on the official calendar. In fact, Colm applied to and was rejected from the Paris Fashion Week calendar multiple times, but rather than getting discouraged, this actually motivated him. He told himself that if they were taking the time to send him a rejection letter, it meant that they were at least looking at his work. And if they were looking at his work, he'd eventually get his opportunity. In the meantime, however, he needed to find his own opportunities, or at the very least, wait for them to find him. Well, one of them did find him. He was working at his store in Williamsburg one day when a stylist and her friend walked in to pick out some pieces. The three of them struck up a conversation, and Colm casually mentioned that he was hoping to break into the Fashion Week circuit. At that point, the stylist's friend chimed in and revealed that she worked for a well-known publicist with extensive experience helping brands put on fashion shows. That publicist was Florent Belda, and she offered to introduce them to one another. Although he wasn't quite sure what to expect, Colm agreed to talk with Florent, and during that discussion, he said that he wanted to show his new collection in Paris. If he wasn't going to get accepted onto the official Fashion Week calendar, he thought that Florent could help him do it on his own. Florent agreed to help, so the two of them started planning, and from the jump, this was a far bigger production than anything that Colm had ever worked on before. They decided to host the show inside of one of France's most famous indoor circuses, and he named the collection Bull in a China Shop, which was a metaphor for him coming to Paris where no one thought that he belonged and shaking things up so much that he couldn't be ignored any longer. It's certainly poetic, but unfortunately, things didn't quite pan out that way. Between renting out the venue, flying in the cast of models, which was mostly made up of his own friends and family, and of course producing the collection itself, the entire thing cost Colm tens of thousands of dollars, and in a later interview with Forbes, he shares that he made none of it back. The collection was great, but the fact of the matter is that KidSuper wasn't a well-known name in the European fashion market, and those who did know the name assumed that it was just another streetwear brand from New York. For that reason, he got almost no press. The bull had walked in and out of the china shop, and not a single dish had been shattered. But if you've learned anything about Colm so far, it's that he always bounces back bigger and better. You see, in 2019, the same year that he presented his first runway show in Paris, he announced that KidSuper would be partnering with Puma. And I don't mean just one pair of sneakers, they'd actually go on to release several capsule collections that were largely inspired by Colm's love of soccer. Something I was waiting until now to mention is that he actually played soccer in Brazil for a year after high school before enrolling at NYU. So as I'm sure you can imagine, the sport is near and dear to his heart. As far as how this partnership came to be, the bottom line is that Puma took a chance on KidSuper. Colm himself has admitted that KidSuper is not the type of brand that Puma typically works with, but they liked what he was doing and gave him the freedom to take the collab in whichever direction he wanted. So it goes without saying that this partnership was a big deal for him, and getting co-signed by a company like Puma definitely pushed KidSuper further into the spotlight. But even throughout all of this, Colm's mind kept drifting back to Fashion Week. That same year, he hosted another show in New York for the presentation of KidSuper's Spring-Summer 2020 collection. Then, in 2020, he applied yet again to Paris Fashion Week, hoping to present KidSuper's Fall-Winter 2020 collection. And yet again, he was rejected. But just as he had done the time before, he flew to Paris and presented the collection anyway. Last time, it had cost him thousands of dollars and failed to draw any press. But in his mind, if that happened again, so be it. It wasn't about money, it wasn't about fame, it was about earning his spot among the biggest names in fashion, and he didn't intend to stop until he had done just that. So ahead of KidSuper's Spring-Summer 2021 collection, he applied to Paris Fashion Week yet again, hoping that this time the outcome would be different. And it was, because this time his application had been accepted. Colm could hardly believe his eyes when he saw that KidSuper had been accepted onto the Paris Fashion Week calendar. But at the same time, he could believe it, because it's what he had been working towards relentlessly this entire time. But here's the unfortunate yet ironic twist of fate. After working all of these years to get on the Paris Fashion Week calendar, Colm was not allowed to go to Paris, because he received his acceptance letter during the early months of the COVID-19 outbreak. In other words, he was on the schedule, but flying to Paris and presenting it in a showroom was not an option. He easily could have just taken a couple of pictures and sent them in like many of the other designers were planning to do, but for him, this was also not an option. In his mind, getting onto the Paris Fashion Week calendar was never the finish line. It was the starting line. To use soccer as an analogy, which I'm sure he'd appreciate, he didn't just want to make the team, he wanted to be in the starting lineup. And once he was in the starting lineup, he wanted to score the game-winning goal. That's the type of mindset that got him to this point in the first place, and he wasn't about to abandon it now. So he got to thinking, and eventually settled on going with what he knows best: art. Specifically, he decided to do a stop-motion animation of an entire fashion show, beginning to end. Along with members of his production team, Colm crafted a set of miniature models, audience members, a runway, and best of all, scaled down versions of the actual pieces from the collection, which was titled Everything is Fake Until It's Real. The name was fitting for a couple of reasons. Foremost, it was symbolic of the journey he had taken to get to this point. I mean, there were a lot of people who never thought that KidSuper would make it this far, and some of them were quite vocal about it. But this was Colm's way of saying, hey, if you don't believe in me, fine, let me show you. And that's what he did. Making it onto the official Fashion Week calendar is a notoriously difficult thing to do, but he was determined to make it happen. In fact, if you take a close look at the first outfit from each of his prior shows in Paris, you'll see that it features his rejection letter from that season. That's because he told himself he'd include his rejection letter in every collection until he finally got approved, which is why the first look of his Spring-Summer 2021 collection proudly features his approval letter instead. Now, back to what I was saying about the name of the collection, it was also fitting because the stop-motion animation format allowed Colm and his team to bend the rules of reality a little bit. What I mean by this is that their miniature runway models were actually miniature models of famous celebrities, including Kanye West, Travis Scott, Pele, Stephen Hawking, and 50 Cent, just to name a few. If the show had been live and in person, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that none of these people would have been walking the runway for KidSuper, but because it was an animation, the constraints of reality did not apply. To really drive this home, Colm even made a tongue-in-cheek post on Instagram after the show where he thanked Travis Scott for clearing his busy schedule to walk the runway. Anyways, the collection itself was great, but the presentation is what really made it go viral. In its formal debut on the Paris Fashion Week schedule, KidSuper had completely stolen the show, and from that point forward, there was no turning back. Colm had always known that he'd be successful if he could get his work seen by the right people, and as it turns out, he was right. I've often said that Paris Fashion Week is fashion's main stage, meaning that if you make it there, anyone who's someone in the industry is probably going to see it, or at the very least hear about it. In this case, that proved to be true. Less than 1 year after the presentation of Everything's Fake Until It's Real, Colm was selected as a finalist for the LVMH Prize for Young Fashion Designers. The LVMH Prize was created to honor the next generation of great designers, and it should come as no surprise that it's extremely prestigious. In 2021, the year that Colm was selected, the panel of judges determining the winners included Marc Jacobs, Kim Jones, Stella McCartney, and the late Virgil Abloh, just to name a few. To make the stakes even higher, the winner of the prize is awarded about $300,000 and 1 year of mentorship from LVMH. In addition to that, there's a prize for the runner-up known as the Karl Lagerfeld Prize, and the winner of that is awarded about $150,000 and also gets a year of mentorship from LVMH. Well, first place went to Central St. Martin's graduate Nancy Dojaka, but Colm did end up being one of 3 designers to win the Karl Lagerfeld Prize. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure he was thrilled about the money, but what really made this special for him is that the judges I just listed all took the time to conduct an in-depth review of his work and agreed it was worthy of an award. I mean, it's sort of crazy to think about. Less than a year earlier, he was sitting on a pile of rejection letters, and now there he was with some of the most influential people in the history of fashion, claiming that he was among the most promising designers of his generation. In 2022, about a year after being selected as the finalist for the LVMH Prize, Colm was nominated for the CFDA Vogue Fashion Fund Prize as well. The CFDA Vogue Fashion Fund Prize is another prize aimed at honoring and supporting the next generation of designers, and has a panel of judges headed by the legendary Anna Wintour. Anna Wintour is a notoriously harsh fashion critic, so it speaks volumes that she deemed KidSuper to be worthy of consideration for the prize. Not only that, but in 2022, he was also named one of just 5 finalists for the CFDA's American Emerging Designer of the Year award. For lack of better words, I'd say that this is basically the CFDA's Rookie of the Year award, and although Elena Velez was eventually named the winner, I think it's safe to say that Colm was finally starting to get the recognition that he deserved. It had been more than a decade since he started KidSuper, and during that time, he had more than his fair share of setbacks. But he never doubted himself. He knew that his time would come, and at long last, it finally had. The biggest institutions in fashion were now honoring his work, and the biggest designers in fashion were praising him for it. It's honestly quite surreal, and it appears that this is just the beginning. In early 2023, Louis Vuitton announced that Colm had been brought on as a guest creative director for the fashion house's Fall/Winter 2023 menswear collection. So I'm going to break all of this down, but first, let's just stop and acknowledge how crazy that is. This kid from Williamsburg with no formal training in fashion was now being called upon by Louis Vuitton. So how did this happen? Well, I don't know for certain, but if I had to venture a guess, I'd say it was the LVMH prize that opened the door. Aside from the star-studded panel of judges that I already mentioned, several artistic directors from LVMH also served as judges, as did Delphine Arnault, the executive vice president of Louis Vuitton. Then, also remember that Colm won a year of mentorship from LVMH, so what I'm getting at here is that the higher-ups at LVMH were not only aware of his work, but they were already working with him in some capacity. So like I said, that may be what opened up the door for him, but beyond that, I also think that he was just a fitting choice. I'm not sure that this influenced the decision in any way, But think about who he was stepping in for. Virgil Abloh. When you put it on paper, there's actually a lot of similarities between the two of them. Both Colm and Virgil grew up in the Midwest. Both of them played soccer. Both of them got college degrees, but neither studied fashion. Both of them got their start selling graphic tees before crossing over into the world of luxury fashion. Both of them were nominated for the LVMH prize, and now both of them have directed for Louis Vuitton. Maybe you'll disagree, but I also see some similarities between their approaches to design. Let me be clear, I'm not trying to equate the two of them. They are of course distinct, and each designer's collections can easily be identified as their own. I just mean that they've both adopted this fun, experimental approach that challenges the idea of what is art and what is fashion. And I think that's why Colm fit in so well as a guest director. Since Virgil's passing back in 2021, his design team at Louis Vuitton has been in charge of putting out new collections, and they've done a fantastic job. From what I understand, they were still the driving force behind this Fall/Winter 2023 collection, and Colm's role as guest creative director was just to add his own personal flair while sort of tying everything together. And look, the collection speaks for itself. It's well executed, it's thought-provoking, and it embodies elements of both Louis Vuitton and KidSuper. So if you ask me, Colm's tenure as guest creative director was a resounding success. But in the meantime, he's also had his hands full with KidSuper. Just 2 days after presenting his show for Louis Vuitton in Paris, he presented his show for KidSuper. And let me tell you, I have watched a lot of fashion shows, but I've never seen one quite like this. In lieu of a traditional fashion show, he opted to host a comedy show, where the comedians are the ones modeling the looks from the collection. I'm admittedly a bit biased here, because one of the only things I love as much as fashion is stand-up comedy. So just picture how excited I was when I heard about this. Better yet, the lineup of comedians was top tier. It included Tyra Banks, Jeff Ross, Andrew Schultz, Andrew Santino, Theo Von, Yvonne Orji, Farid, Stavros Halkias, Matteo Lane, and for some reason, J Balvin also made an appearance. Just to put this into context for those of you who aren't as familiar with the world of stand-up comedy, lineups don't get much better than this. So it was a real treat for fans of comedy, and it was also a real treat for fans of fashion. Because like I said, it was just such a fun, original idea for him to bring to Paris Fashion Week. All things considered, it was a fantastic show, but my favorite moment may have been at the very end, when Colm walked on stage, confetti falling from the ceiling, and told the audience that he had one last joke. Over the sound of roaring applause, he said, "Knock knock," and they replied, "Who's there?" Looking straight ahead, laughing but not joking, he said, "The new brand in town," and then dropped the mic. To me, this moment perfectly encapsulates everything that we've talked about. Colm has always been this fun, outgoing guy. He likes to joke around, but even back in the days when he was selling t-shirts to his friends, he was nothing but serious about making it big. For all of the cool collections and outlandish presentations that we get to see, you have to think about the countless hours and sleepless nights that we don't see. If you look at everything that's happened over the past 2 years, you would think that KidSuper was a veritable overnight sensation. But then take a step back, remember that he launched the brand more than a decade ago out of his college dorm room, and it wasn't always easy. There were plenty of times he could have quit, and I'm sure that many others in his position would have. But now, he's an award-winning designer whose runway shows are among the most anticipated at Paris Fashion Week, and he's even served as the creative director for a Louis Vuitton collection. So when he says that KidSuper is the new brand in town, he means it. In many ways, I think that this is the beginning, or at least the beginning of a new chapter, and I can't wait to see where Colm takes it. Anyways, that's all for now. If you liked this video, please remember to subscribe, and also check out the Threaducation Patreon down in the description for exclusive content and early access to episodes like these. Other than that, thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time.